So here we are at the offices of Edelman for the Editorial Intelligence and Total Politics and Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism debate, the Bloggertariat versus the Commentariat. What do we mean by that? Well, you can listen to the entire podcast, you can hear some of the speakers give their account, but essentially it's who rules supreme, online or on the page or on both, on the key arguments of the day. Have a listen, have a look, and you decide.
I don't think there is a war between the Bloggertariat and the Commentariat. There might be a phony war, but in fact the reality is that the Bloggertariat grew out of the Commentariat. It is a kind of blood-sucking leech on the Commentariat, and the two things are inextricably linked to each other.
Actually, I don't think it's one set of people against another set of people. I think it's technology is driving all of us to change our habits and how we actually communicate with our audiences.
I don't think there's a war between bloggers and commentators. Effectively, we're all in the same game. We're all trying to offer comment. I think commentators used to regard bloggers as slightly beneath their contempt, but I think that's changed now.
Bloggers sit outside of the traditional institutions and the traditional clubs. So I think the public are ready for a more honest form of information, and it's easier for them to ask those questions. So I suspect that the language of journalism, particularly of news reporting, will shift in that way to be more honest and open.
I think that the Commentariat has actually got something out of some blogging people. I read some blogs constantly, and every now and again I get an idea which I wouldn't otherwise have got, or see something I wouldn't otherwise have seen.
In general terms, I guess I don't really like commentary or blogging very much. I do think that the first is the comment is generally speaking complacent, lazy, smug, and that the second is kind of, how to make notes about this obviously, is a vicious, unsophisticated kind of white noise. I think generally speaking that's the case. I decided that I wouldn't say that, because when I thought about it, it wasn't really fair to say that one was a kind of parasitical flip side of the other.
The comment that you get online, I think, is generally speaking of a different order to the commentary that you get in print. Increasingly, of course, the two are no different at all, because you get the commentary online anyway. In essence, the blogging commentary that you get online is, in its very nature, much more immediate, and it is not as thought through, and my feeling is that it will not last as long.
Actually, writing thoughtfully about contemporary events as they happen is extremely difficult to do. I know it because I've tried to do both, because I'm a blogger and was a commentator, and it really is hard. And comparing the influence of my writing for the New Statesman to my blog for The Spectator, it's certainly the case that Downing Street cares a lot more about what I write for The Spectator than they ever did when I wrote for the New Statesman.
The online advertising revenue has fallen away so much more quickly than the newspaper revenue on our site. So I think that search for a commercial model is a really big issue, because without money, none of us will be sending people off to Tehran and Baghdad and all the other things that we do in journalism. So major thoughts on this area. I think this year has been the most fascinating year for the relationship between blogs and commenters and newspapers. I think we've had a couple of big stories, particularly the Damien Bride affair and the expenses story, which have shown us that the two of us are working together. And I think that bloggers will influence the way that journalism happens in newspapers, and increasingly there'll be the same people who are doing both.
We've changed the behaviour of the Bloggertariat. Many commentators now are becoming bloggers. They've cut the amount of money that's available for big journalism, but online bloggers have started a party that has proved irresistible to most of the Commentariat that, 5 or 6 years ago were doing most of their work in the paper, not online. And fundamentally, it is a different way of communicating. It's peer-to-peer. It's not simply speaking into a kind of a black box and out there. What are the differences? Well, there's more of us than there are of them. On the whole, I have to admit they are better writers, but there are many more of us than there are of them. And our networks are absolutely vast. Our sources, and this is crucial, I think, our sources are not always inside the golden circle.
But I think what's also happened over the last few years is that bloggers have been able to hold the traditional commentariat to account
for some of the rubbish that from time to time they write. And of course that gets an instant reaction from the Commentariat, who don't like it because they're not used to being held to account in this way. When Jackie Ashley one week says how wonderful Gordon Brown is and that he bestrides the political stage like a colossus, and then the next week he must go because he's a walking disaster, and thinks that somehow she should be paid £1,000 a column or whatever she gets to write this rubbish.
I think what I've had most reaction to are blog posts on Israel, climate change, or homosexuality. But generally I get far more reaction to blog posts than if I write for a newspaper or appear on television. You get a few emails from those sorts of things, but a blog is so instantaneous that people can give you their instant reaction, which is more difficult to do on a newspaper column.
I wrote a column for nearly 2 years on the Daily Telegraph, and I found it a real challenge to do. And I found that the one column that I wrote that I just bashed off in 20 minutes was the best column I ever wrote, because it was how I was used to writing, whereas I thought I should be copying all these sort of big names who no doubt spend hours and hours crafting their words. Are we trusted? I'm not sure I totally agree with Mick on that. I think that people do trust big names that they've heard of. I think bloggers have got a long way to go to earn trust, but in the end it's our readers that hold us accountable. My readership's doubled over the last 4 months. People don't come to you unless they trust you as a source or they trust what you're saying.
I think people who have written blog posts, who have their own blogs, have been discovered. People like Dizzy Things, for example, he writes now for newspapers from time to time. The people who leave comments, it's more difficult. A lot of them are anonymous anyway, so you don't know who they are. Some of them are actually beautifully crafted. If you don't know who the person is, how are you actually going to spot them?
One of the reasons why the Bloggertariat in its present form gets such a lift is actually because we in the written journalism and broadcast journalism give it a lift. Let's give an example. I was amazed when watching through one of Labour's recent crises on on BBC News 24, and it was a crisis about the Labour Party and internal Labour politics, to see Iain Dale cropping up all the time as a blogger, because Iain knows nothing about the Labour Party whatsoever. And that's fine, because you wouldn't expect it to be right. When he was on the Tory party, I would expect a sort of surer grasp, and every now and again you get it. I use bloggers, and my favourite bloggers, quite a bit. I use them as sources of information I can't otherwise get, and it's exactly as Mick has said. There's a form of democratisation there. It is an unreliable democratisation, but democratisation usually is unreliable. In the other sense, I don't really know what I'm getting, and I don't really know who's talking to me, and I know that if they get it badly wrong, no one's going to fire them. Bad bloggers are nearly as bad journalists, and that's saying quite a lot, but they are even more irritating in that they add even worse comment sections in which people who are even more ignorant, stupid and sarcastic than they are then add their element of comment. And I think that just makes it appalling.
News is now a commodity. It's the conversations about who we are, where we're going, what we're doing. All of that stuff is the stuff of the Commentariat, and it's bringing people from the outside of that conversation, previously who would have been tried to get onto the letters page of the Times or the Guardian or the Independent or the Telegraph, and were edited out. Now they're editing themselves in.